WYSIWYG is long established as a concept in the tabletop game of Warhammer 40,000. But if you are a newer player and also have skipped or missed my abbreviations explained video, then you may be unfamiliar. You may also see it spelt WYSIWYG, where people have taken the phonetic sound and just capitalized it, but WYSIWYG is correct, because it is what you see is what you get. So a heavy weapon team with a las cannon fires a las cannon. That would follow WYSIWYG. If you said, no, this is an auto cannon for this game, then it would not follow WYSIWYG. The purpose of WYSIWYG is so your opponent can see what weapons and units you have at a glance. Even if you don't know the rules fully, the Warhammer models are designed to look right. So a rotary cannon has lots of shots, big gun with a long barrel looks anti-tank, big gun with wide barrel probably has blast, best to keep your heavy infantry away from that. Saying that wide barrel cannon is actually a long barrel cannon when it isn't can be a little confusing. Following WYSIWYG keeps things simple. I am a vampire and I play 40k. I am not an arson rabbit. You can see very clearly that I am not a rabbit, and I have never, I have rarely talked about starting fires. If your opponent doesn't follow WYSIWYG, it can cause upset because you have to remember something else on top of the main rules, on top of your army rules and unit rules and stratagems and the mission rules and was I meant to pick up my daughter from football or is that tomorrow? Now I need to remember that my opponent only has one melter gun in that squad because the other one is a heavy flamer, and do I even have a daughter? I don't know anymore. Sometimes because of the older models, you might not actually be able to tell what a weapon is. These are all melter guns used by various factions, and the diversity of flamers is even greater. So it doesn't always help to use the official models, but usually it helps. Then again, official models can be a stretch. The McFarlane toys are official Warhammer models, and in theory, can be used in games. Games Workshop has previously provided card and paper models, most notably the 2nd edition Orc Dreadnought was card, and I have several official Dark Eldar models that are also made of card, as provided by Games Workshop. But if something is not WYSIWYG, then it is called a count-as or a proxy. Interpretations of these two terms vary, so for simplicity I will just group them together for now under not the model you were expecting for what your opponent says it is. It's a broad church, I know, but you get it? Good. Although this has come up a lot more in 10th edition 40k, we were also seeing it strongly at the end of 9th edition. Space Marine Sergeants became renowned for having pocket thunderhammers, once the points for all of their close combat weapons became the same. This is what it all stems from. The points per unit used to have a base cost and then additional points for better equipment. But once it was all free, yes, you want a bolt pistol, not a las pistol. Why would you even consider the las pistol when you get an extra point of strength for no additional cost? For some people this was a lot easier. You didn't proxy a flamer as a melter gun to fill the last 5 points in your army and just ran it as a flamer. Other people called every flamer a melter gun. At the end of 9th edition, melter was king, as it had been since early in 8th edition and the introduction of the damage stats. For you newer players, every weapon used to do 1 wound, but if a weapon's strength was double the enemy toughness, they were just dead, with very few exceptions. Let's look at the Acolyte Hybrids. Here's an Acolyte Hybrid. It has Cult Claws and Knife and an auto pistol. This model is definitely not worth 17 points. 5 points more than a Space Marine Templar who gets an extra wound, an extra point of leadership, and a much better save. A deep striking dude with a dagger doesn't do the damage that a dark armored dude does. At the very least, this model wants a hand flamer. It's free, so why would you have a 12-inch range one-shot weapon hitting on a 4+ when you can have a 12-inch range D6 shots auto hitting at exactly the same strength with special rules like ignores cover? Obviously the hand flamer is much better. For ease, when so many weapons have been merged, like the Combi Plasma, Combi Melter and Combi Flamer all becoming Combi weapons with one profile, or the Deathwatch things merging into the amorphous Long Vigil ranged weapons, I would have just had Cult Pistols. 3 shots, so it's faster than rolling D3 or D6 shots per model, just 3 shots. With Torrent to auto hit, then it's even simpler, because you don't even need to roll to hit, at strength 3, damage 1. That would roughly make them equal and could represent firing off the whole auto pistol clip in one. The points for this model went up in the recent balance patch to counter the very, very powerful strikes of the demo charges. So if this model is in a unit and none of the models have demo charges, then you're losing out, because they've been costed as if they have demo charges. The Imperial Guard Artillery, it's costed for the indirect fire gun. Why would you take the heavy las cannon? But with the Acolyte Hybrids, what if you bought the Overkill box, then you got 12 Acolyte Hybrids, none of which have mining weapons or demolition charges? Now, it is a legal way to run them. You can absolutely do 10 guys with auto pistols and cult claws, and that is a legal unit, but you're massively losing out on utility and damage output for no additional cost, when you should have a cult icon and can take up to 4 heavy mining tools or 4 demolition charges, which is the current way to run them, because that's what the points are costed for. So if you only have the Acolytes with claws and knife, what do? Do you run them just with the cult claw and auto pistol? Or do you say that, oh, 4 of them have demolition charges and 1 of them has a cult icon and 1 of them has the leader cult weapons? How do you mark them as different? This is the quandary of the day. Many models come with free war gear, like the Wolf and Stormfrag auto launchers. Any model can have them, so obviously you should take them, even if not all the models are showing it. The points are the same with or without. Now, it can be pretty easy on the Space Marine Sergeants. You can see that the model has a bolter, and then you get told this one model also has a power weapon. Fair enough, they're the only one in the squad not wearing a helmet, so they are distinct. What about the Tyrannid Termagants? A lot of people have the Termagants from the Leviathan box set, the launch box for 10th edition of Warhammer 40,000. Those models all have flesh borers. Now, it could be simple enough to say to your opponent that these are actually spine fists in the army instead. One alien weapon that you're not familiar with and another very similar alien weapon that you're not familiar with is easy enough. Necron warrior squads having all Gauss Reapers instead of Gauss Flayers? Easy. The issue now with the Termagants is that they have updated rules and updated models with more weapon options. I mean, I say updated, but of course they are the beautiful 2nd edition weapons come round again. And if you have these models, your decades of waiting for them to be legal again have finally paid off. But the weapons are free. And they're better than the base weapons that the models have, like the Flesh Borers and the Devourers. Logic dictates you should include them. So what's the solution? Well, you could paint 3 heads to be distinct. If all of the crests are red, you could have one that's got a black head for a spike rifle, a white head for a shard launcher, and a green head for a strangleweb. That way, the models are marked as being different and having different weapons, similar to how the Sergeant, without the helmet, is obviously the Sergeant. And the way that Termagants are hunched over and running in hordes, it would be hard for your opponent to see what guns they had anyway, so a painted head might actually be better and easier to see. And this is us just talking about weapons. We haven't even got into the correct base debate, if that was important. For Age of Sigmar, Games Workshop has rules about the base sizes. For 40k, it's just whatever the model came with. If you have the older Orcs, Gene Stealers, Sisters of Battle or Space Marines, they were all on 25mm bases, but now have bigger bases. So some people are fine with whatever base the model came on, others are like, you really should correct that and change the model, rip the base off and put it on a brand new base. I don't care. Smaller bases, bigger bases, there are advantages and disadvantages. But that's not today. WYSIWYG. What is Games Workshop's stance on WYSIWYG? WYSIWYG was an official Games Workshop gaming term when they included it in their documents once 3rd edition turned up, and the plastic kits of that edition allowed for more weapon options. Once players had choice, they felt they could make the wrong choice. So this rule was brought in to make it so that a Space Marine model with a flamer didn't count as having a plasma gun. A rule that was then promptly ignored by many players once the idea was planted in their mind that they could just proxy a flamer as a melter gun. I think the last time that WYSIWYG appeared as a rule was in the 5th edition. By 6th edition, the rule wasn't part of the standard guidance, along with things like wobbly models, what dice are, and why we measure in inches. So arguably, WYSIWYG has been dead long before 10th edition, but players have just kept it up as a practice. What is Games Workshop's current stance? At tournaments it varies. There is an expectation that you'll have the right model with the correct war gear, apart from minor things like grenades and pistols that rarely come up. However, tournament players and organisers are very familiar with this issue and will often allow things like the cult auto pistol to be a cult hand flamer. Minor things like that. As long as they can look at the model and know what it has at a glance, a pistol is a pistol. But Games Workshop really hasn't helped to keep WYSIWYG. A Thunderhammer on an Assault Intercessor is very small, like a child's squeaky toy. But the one on the Death Watch is a massive two-handed thing, and they have very similar profiles. While the Thunderhammers on the Vanguard veterans are more like power swords under the moniker of heirloom weapons. And then there's the Death Watch. Shotguns and Stalker bolt guns, are they now using the bolt gun stats or the long vigil range weapon stats? Kill Team Cassius, a unit that I have nicely painted up that has a plasma pistol, hand flamer, melter gun, and combi melter, all with the same profile. A power sword and chainsword are both long vigil combat weapons, which in that squad weirdly has the same stats as a combat knife. If WYSIWYG is dead, surely it was Games Workshop that killed it in this edition. But are players sticking to it? I've been asking players and running polls and have had some results. Most of you do not follow WYSIWYG anymore, and I have a lot of comments about why you don't, why you do, and really where that line is between acceptable and unacceptable. The reasons not to proxy models and just follow WYSIWYG tend to come down to ease and fun. You feel better when you're playing your army straight. So Flamers were bad in 9th edition, Melters were great. Now we are in 10th edition, Overwatch has made Flamers great, and Melter guns are bad at doing their job of destroying vehicles. So if your mate was proxying their Flamers as Melter guns in last edition and now are proxying their Melter guns as Flamers, you can sit there with a smug look on your face, being like, guess who was right about Flamers? It was me, the person who plays honestly. And your army will match the law. Not all Imperial Guard sergeants have bolt pistols. Most of them have las pistols. It's easier for you to remember what your models have. If you have a Flamer model and you know Flamers have a 12-inch range, will it be annoying in the second hour of a 2,000-point game when you forget that you were actually using it as a plasma gun, it has a 24-inch range, and you haven't been firing it for the last 2 turns? Just playing your models straight with WYSIWYG makes list building far quicker than before. Even quicker than it is already with the just points and units. If you are using Battlescribe or the Games Workshop app, you don't need to bother filling in all the weapon details and checkboxes, figuring out if you want a relic sword that you need to unequip the power sword, equip the chainsword, and then you can swap that chainsword for the relic sword. You know what your models have, you can just click the button to add the unit. And when you're playing, there isn't any sudden break in immersion when a heavy tank goes down to 4 heavy bolters from a Retributor squad that are being proxied as multi-melters. Actually, let's just say in that example they take down a light tank. Multi-melters are not that good right now. And you can also think about things that are not the best weapons and come up with new ideas. So chainswords are very much overlooked as a weapon. Look at the Assault Marines. They're going to go to Legends, but even then they can still be used. Games Workshop has said so. They can get +1 to wound on their chainswords, or lethal hits, or sustained hits, just because they have chainswords. So when you have the Sergeant, who could choose to have a power sword instead, choose the chainsword. It gets the bonuses. You're all sleeping on chainswords. Like, not literally. If you have a chainsword on your Sister Superior, and they are in a squad with a Palatine, you get lethal hits. A chainsword has 3 attacks, a power sword has 2 attacks, so if you're picking the chainsword, then you have more dice with which you can roll a 6 and automatically wound. If you have a Canoness and you want to equip the Blade of St. Eleanor, a chainsword will give you more attacks with that special weapon compared to equipping her with a relic sword that is the Blade of St. Eleanor. Chainsword Blade of St. Eleanor can be better. These are the thoughts that come to life when you have your army as WYSIWYG. So why do people proxy? Well, you get better weapons. It doesn't seem fair that a Genestealer cult player has to have deliberately worse pistols on their acolytes for no extra gain. This isn't anything new. Even in 2nd edition, there were metal assault marines that came with bolt pistols. People could ignore WYSIWYG and run some as plasma pistols and some as hand flamers, perhaps with different color schemes on the pistols to differentiate. Proxying the weapons lets you build the models however you want, how they look cool, how they look good on a shelf. And then, when it comes to the tabletop, you can use the most effective rules to have what should be a close game. If you have 60 acolytes, but they're all armed with claws and auto pistols, and you're spending 17 points a model on that, you are far less likely to win and give your opponent a competitive game than if you're running them as if they had demolition charges. Other people proxy because they're very early into the hobby. They don't have a lot of models, so they use cheap plastic soldiers as space marines to get used to the rules. Tiny boxes become chimeras, so you can learn the rules for what a chimera is, how it's used. You could use an apple as a dreadnought. As it loses wounds, you take a bite out of the apple. Fun times. Also then put a dice next to it, with the wounds counting down, so your opponent can see how many wounds your model has remaining. Then, as you go further into the hobby, you might want to try a second army, but without buying the models. What is this Genestealer cult all about? So you use the Dark Eldar models you have, maybe the models you picked up in the 3rd edition starter set, as a Genestealer cult model to try out the rules. And if you were wanting to at least keep up with the meta, it's expensive or damaging to correct models. Pulling them off bases, cutting off arms, is something you're then going to have to repaint and fix. Not everyone has small magnets with which to fit into the very thin arms of the battle system models, and the weapons that the units have can change. Not just what is best, but what is even allowed. In 8th edition, a Sister Superior could change her bolt pistol for an Inferno pistol, and keep her bolt gun. So I have 2 Superiors that have a bolt gun and a special pistol. I tell my opponents to just ignore the bolt gun. If you had 2 units of Dominions in 9th edition, 4 models with melter guns and a Superior, and a unit with 4 models wielding flamers and a Superior, now they have to be in a squad of 10 models. So instead of breaking the weapons on the models and trying to find some bolt guns to paint up and fit into the broken gap, you could just ask your opponent to ignore the melter guns. They are bolt guns, and they are assault. Some units as a whole may not exist, so you use the rules that are the closest to the models. Let's say Assault Marines were just deleted instead of going to Legends. You could then proxy them as Assault Intercessors. Pariah models stopped having rules, so people ran them as Lichguard. The weapons are not quite right, but they're close enough. Eldar Warlocks no longer have las pistols. Imperial Guard Sergeants and Commissars can no longer have hand flamers, even though nothing instills more fervour than seeing a coward suddenly catch fire as a means of summary execution. Or you might want better models. The Horus Heresy Tactical Marines are bigger and arguably nicer than the older models in the Tactical Squad box. But you don't get any special weapons. You might have to proxy that the 2 Chainblade models have frag cannons, and the 2 models with knife bayonets have long vigil melee weapons. Not following WYSIWYG also allows you to have fan armies. You may have an all-Kroot army, and all the models are Kroot. Until recently, you couldn't run an all-Kroot army, and even now it's not particularly viable. So you would play them as Genestealer Cult, or as Orcs, or another army with a similar style. I saw an old 1st edition squat army being used with the rules for orcs because the squats were tough and had a lot of strange bikes. This matched the orc style at the time, and then there were rules to use those models in an army. Now, the squats are called the Leagues of Votann, and with how their rules were, people were thinking, maybe I should just proxy these as orcs. Like feral orcs. If you wanted a feral orc army, something that hasn't been explored much on the tabletop, then you could have boars with orcs riding them, and the boars have big shooters on either side of the saddles. They could be war bikers rather than Squighog boys. The 2nd edition models were much like this, and they do exist in some player armies. To play your Drukhari army to any kind of effectiveness, you are expected to have Witches, Cabalites, and Raks. The requirements of the detachments used to insist on the 3 types of leaders all being present. This led to proxies, otherwise the army was at a very serious handicap to command points and ability. So do people allow proxies? I've read a lot of comments about it, and the feelings are generally this. Yes, proxies are okay for unseen items, like a plasma pistol instead of a bolt pistol when all you can see on the model is a holster, and you get told, this is a plasma pistol. Most people are fine with proxies of very similar things. When Intercessors in 9th edition had 3 different kinds of bolt gun options, very few people cared which one you had as long as you were consistent across the army and every model had the same, or the units had different coloured shoulder pads to tell you which weapon was which. But the colours of sub-factions don't matter much anymore. There are no blue scars, a term from 6th edition when bikers were really powerful and a lot of players with Ultramarine armies, the most common one that was around, were calling their Ultramarines white scars to get better bike rules. It might raise an eyebrow if your Deathwatch army was bright green instead of their famous black, but as long as the models are all WYSIWYG, I don't think people would mind, even at tournaments. For sub-factions like Space Marine chapters, you just pick the detachment you want, you get those rules. It doesn't matter how the army is painted. There are certain styles, so the Gladius Task Force is Ultramarine style, but you could have any chapter play that way, with that detachment, and you could have your Ultramarines play as one of the new detachments that are coming out, using similar models from other game systems as stand-ins, generally seen as okay. Here is my Robotech Genestealer Cult Sentinel. People ask what it is because they don't recognize the model, but they can see it has a heavy flamer, Sentinel chainsword, and is about the same size as a Sentinel. Also, when I put it down, I say, this is a Sentinel. Using scratch-built thematic units is generally seen as good, as long as you can see roughly what the army should be. Then great, you get to play against a unique army. Doing as I suggested and painting Termagant's heads is okay, because you can see which models are unusual even if you can't see the weapon. And the alien weapons, you often can't see what they might be good against. Not that you would be able to know even by looking. So you'd have to tell people, oh, spike rifles are for penetrating armor. Strangle webs are for blast, etc. It gets less okay where a model is clearly brandishing a sword and you're calling that a power fist, but tends to be forgiven especially if the weapon you want, like a multi-melter, is not provided in the box of the Sisters of Battle, if that even is the optimal build, which you can find out here. But the feeling is, if a proxy is done for the sake of chasing the meta rather than rule of cool, tolerance towards breaking WYSIWYG goes down. For different tanks of similar sizes, using a rhino as an immolator may be okay. If there are no other rhinos in the list, it is more likely to be accepted, and if you put 2 battle sisters with heavy flamers on top as a reminder, then it gets much more into the acceptable range. It's less okay where you were using vehicles with different sizes, like saying that rhino is now a land raider. But now we get into the more abstract shapes and colours. A matchbox as a tank, action figure without a base is an Imperial Knight, a big potato with its 4 shoots coming off is actually a Bio-Titan, the tin of beans on the side is a drop pod that you didn't know about, the can that they were drinking from was a Hammerfall bunker all along, and you just triggered its Overwatch. That Space Marine is a land speeder and it is flying. You use a psychic power to transform a model into a Chaos Spawn. You don't have one spare? Boom! Peter Rabbit statue. No one expects that. 3 bases with nothing on them to represent Tau stealth suits might be a bit much for drawing line of sight, but this depends on what sort of game you're playing. If it is against a child wanting to get into the hobby, or the 2 of you are trying out new things, then it is fine. The sudden appearance of continental breakfast could actually be quite funny instead of strange. But at tournaments, the bar for what is okay goes way up. The rule of thumb is, do your best to be correct, don't take the mickey, and it's all good. But is that how you feel about it? When you look into this more as a measure of degrees rather than a flat yes or no, how far do you go? And how often do you have true WYSIWYG across your army? I thought I did, but as you've heard, neither my battle sisters nor my cultists truly are. A lot of these problems with WYSIWYG come from the changes in points, and you can find out more about that here. My darlings and viewers, have a great day. I think I had something to do.